Okay, we're going to go ahead and pick up where we left off. We were still talking about the integumentary system. Last video we talked about the epidermis mostly, and so the types of tissue that it's made of, what accounts for skin color, and now we're going to move on to the dermis. Remember, there's the epidermis, which is on top, the dermis is in the middle, and then below that, we'll talk about later, is the subcutaneous layer. So now we're with the dermis. And so when it says nerve cell processes are scattered throughout the dermis, think of motor processes. These are the things that are actually, they're carrying impulses to the brain. So those are the muscles that would actually move the muscles. Like, oh, I touched something hot, I need to move. The next thing, sensory processes. They carry those impulses, again, to the brain. So motor, think movement, sensory, think senses. And so both of those contain hair follicles. Okay. And then they also contain those sebaceous glands that we had talked about in the video before, and then sweat glands as well. Okay. Another thing is that we talk about vitamin D, like you go out in the sun and it gives you vitamin D, but the sun doesn't actually give vitamin D. It has to be synthesized by the skin in order for it to be usable by the body. So don't just think that the sun gives you vitamin D. It does, but you also have to have the skin and things in the skin to actually make that synthesis possible. Okay, so just kind of review again. You've got the epidermis on top, and the dermis were here in the middle. Those are the two terms. Make sure you're remembering right now. Okay, so now we're underneath. We're in the subcutaneous layer. So there's not really a sharp boundary between the dermis and the subcutaneous layer, and not a, definitive thing that you can notice between the two. But it does have, you can see these little sort of dots right there, that they have adipose, so that fatty tissue, or I'll just call it an adipose, tissue layer. And what does that provide? Insulation. Okay, and then it also contains, that's where your major blood vessels are held. And so, you can kind of think about, like a paper cut. Your paper cut is generally going to be up here on the epidermis. So there's nerve endings there and it hurts, but it's not going to bleed unless it goes down here to the subcutaneous layer. So it does hurt, but generally you're not going to see any blood loss from that. Okay. Moving down to healing of wounds. So inflammation is when blood vessels dilate or get bigger. The skin becomes reddened. It's usually warm to the touch. It's swollen and painful. That's all it means to be inflamed. Okay, so in a shallow injury, so that means not all the way down necessarily to the subcutaneous layer. In a shallow injury, those epithelial cells in the area are stimulated to divide more, we could say more rapidly than usual. Because you're always having cell division, especially in your skin cells. Mitosis is happening, skin cells are dividing, they're replacing each other, but when there's an injury, they're still going to divide, but they're getting a signal to say, I need to divide more rapidly to get that injury healed, to fill in the gap. Okay, so healing of wounds. So a deeper injury into the dermis, or that very bottom layer, the subcutaneous layer, the blood vessels are actually broken. They can form a clot. And then after that clotting happens, then you've got a scab. Okay, so now, let's see, the big thing you need to know. No, I'm not going to really, I'll just cross that out. So things that can speed the process, if you've got an injury, you probably know that you can get stitches. You can also get staples. And there's glues also that can help to, fill in the gap. So things like For example, staples, if there's an injury to the head, is generally when there's staples because the skin there is too thick to actually, stitch up. So staples are used there. But for the most part, skin, a lot of times they use stitches. So again, this word was in last chapter, phagocytes. So those are the things that eat up the bad stuff. Okay, so they remove dead cells, debris, like infections, and the damaged tissues are then replaced by mitosis. Then you've got a scab that when it says sloughs off, that just means it falls off. And now in intensive wounds or really bad wounds, new connective tissue may appear. New connective tissue may appear. That's where you would get a scar on the actual surface. Now we're going to move on to skin cancer. So there are 3 major types. You've probably heard of at least one of these. The first one is basal cell carcinoma. And that's least malignant. It's most common. So generally it's confined to one area. You can see it. You can remove, for example, that problem mole and it hasn't spread. That cancer has not spread. So malignant meaning it is easier to cure, get rid of. The next one is called squamous cell carcinoma. Okay, it's the second most common. And this one you probably may have heard of this one. It's called melanoma. This one is the most dangerous, and I'll talk about that one in a second. But those are the 3 main types. These are pretty curable. This one can lead to death. So here's my melanoma. It involves those melanocytes that we had talked about before, the things that would capture up, let's if I can go back to where that was. It's somewhere. Here we go. So those are the specialized cells that produce melanin, which gives you that dark color. But that's what absorbs the UV radiation and prevents mutation from causing cancer. So when you're saying you have melanoma, that's what's actually being affected is those melanocytes, which would absorb UV radiation and prevent cancer. So now, sorry if this is making you dizzy, it is involving those melanocytes. So when it says it's metastatic, it's reproducing very quickly, and it is usually resistant to chemotherapy. It is usually pretty rare, but it's usually from rare sun exposure, a whole bunch of it, maybe at one time, for example, and then extremely bad sunburns, or repeatedly bad sunburns. So there's also wide surgical excision, meaning they're going to try to get rid of that whole thing, and then also try immunotherapy to try to get rid of it in another way. What you do need to know about melanoma, besides what I just said, is what they call the ABCD rule. So A refers to if you have something on your body, or that's grown on your body, and you notice that it's kind of odd looking. Symmetry means it's sort of in an odd pattern. The 2 sides of it, they don't match up. It's not in a perfect circle. Kind of looking at this picture, it's very oddly grown. It's not a perfect circle, or kind of looking like a mole. So asymmetry, that's A. B refers to the border. So there's indentations in the actual border. Let's go back to this. You can kind of see right there what they're talking about. Okay, so it exhibits indentations, kind of like there's high points, there's low points. C is the next thing that they look at, which is color. So there's an odd color to it. It can be black, brown, tan, sometimes red, or even blue. Sometimes kind of all of those can come together in one place. And then another thing they're going to look at is diameter. So looking at how large it is, larger than 6 millimeters. which really isn't that big, but that's the last thing there. So just remember A, B, C, D. So now we're going to talk about the accessory organs really fast. The hair is one of them. And so their function, they alert the body to, could be insects in the skin. Another thing, they guard. So they guard, could be the scalp, for example, against physical trauma, heat loss, and also sunlight. That's a protective layer. And distribution, like where is hair found? They're generally found over the entire body surface except for your palms, the soles of your feet, and then you've noticed your lips do not have any hair. Okay. Your hair follicle receptor. So there's actual nerve endings, and so they are stimulated by bending a hair. Okay. Now that can be, the name of these things, they're called erector pili. Pili, think of like a cell, and then there's itty bitty hairs on, and then you have the actual longer arm hair. So the pili, there's a muscle attached to the follicle. So this muscle is what's actually smooth. Remember the difference between smooth and striated. But if it's smooth muscle, that's what's actually going to make the move whenever, for example, you're cold, causing goosebumps. There's actually smooth muscle that's causing that movement and making a person have what we call goosebumps. I think this is the last thing here. Okay, so hair color. We're again thinking about the external. This is an accessory organ, the hair. So what determines it? Genetics. So genetics are going to tell your, information from your mom and information from your dad are going to direct the type and the amount of pigment that the melanocytes produce. Remember, these are the things that are giving skin color. So genetics play a huge part in what sort of, or what color you will be in terms of those melanocytes. Your hair pigments, if you have dark hair, you have an abundance of, remember that term again, melanin. If you have blonde hair, an intermediate amount of melanin. And then white, if you think of albino, there's literally no melanin that is produced. And then red hair, you have low, and then there's something else, cotrexaderin, which we won't really talk about, but just make sure, some people think that red hair has no melanin, but they do, there's just low amounts. And that is pretty much it for this chapter. So just remember, we have, let's go back to this the big picture here of the 3 layers. This one's not here. So we've got the epidermis, the dermis in the middle, and remember that subcutaneous layer. Okay, and then the big things that I had talked about, remember you've got the glands, you've got the adipose down there, but I would suggest that you definitely, obviously you've taken notes, but rewatch these because this is information that will be on your test. If you have any questions, let me know.